All right, in chapter 15, Jane Maienschein argues that stem cell research utilizing embryonic tissue should be conducted. And I'm going to quote a few of her main arguments here. She says, let us look at what stem cells are, what stem cell research is, what embryonic stem cells are, why researchers want to do embryonic stem cell research in particular, what opponents seem to be thinking that leads them to their poorly informed moral positions, and then add arguments for why such research should be at least allowed, and even why it should be actually conducted. So, what are stem cells? She argues stem cells are called unipotent sometimes, which means they can become just one kind of differentiated cell. Multipotent stem cells are just like they sound, so that they have the capacity to self-replicate like all stem cells do, and also can become differentiated as at least two different kinds of cells. Finally, pluripotent stem cells have the capacity to self-replicate and can become differentiated as any kind of cell. Embryonic stem cells are pluripotent, and researchers are now able to induce pluripotency in adult somatic stem cells too. So, I want to skip to the section, what are embryonic stem cell researchers? Here she reviews some of the science, after she had reviewed some of the important science from just stem cells in general. And she says, these embryonic pluripotent cells are not yet differentiated at all in one of the steps of embryonic development. And she says these are not totipotent, meaning that they do not have the ability to become the whole body with all its different types. Rather, they have plural rather than total potential, and they're therefore called pluripotent. Now, one of the things I want to highlight is that in the development of human embryos, there is a time when there is a cavity inside of the morula's development into a blastocyst, and then the part that I've highlighted here is there's a cluster of cells that make up what's called the inner cell mass. All right, these cells, she says, are completely undifferentiated, but have lost their totipotency. They are now pluripotent stem cells, and they are called embryonic stem cells because they come from the embryo. Okay. What about the section on embryonic stem cell research? Because stem cells, she says, are self-replicating, they can be cultured in glass dishes to produce more and more of themselves. Now, there's some important science that she talks about here. She mentions that the California biotech company named Geron received approval for the first clinical trial using human embryonic stem cells in early 2009. She talks about some of the maneuvering back and forth at the federal level, especially the federal district court ruling on August 23, 2010, when a judge named Royce Lamberth ruled that federal funding cannot be allowed to support human embryonic stem cell research on the grounds that it violates something, called the Dickey-Wicker Amendment. Okay, and this is going to turn into a discussion of this court case. She introduces this in part by saying, the problem in the United States is that Congress has not yet passed clear legislation regulating or endorsing stem cell research. Instead, we have legislative regulation of human subjects research, and we have what's called the Dickey-Wicker Amendment that was passed to restrict federal funding for embryo research, plus a series of presidential executive orders. Beyond that, she says, we are left with a patchwork of state decisions, judicial decisions that some consider legislating from the bench, and presidential orders. Okay, then she talks a little bit about the Clinton White House, a little bit about some of the court decision that came into play with Lamberth, and then of course this actually got reversed. Lamberth ended up being forced to reverse his opinion when a higher court overruled him and kind of sent it back to him to say, fix this. Okay, the section on mistakes of opponents is a section full of some interesting arguments. I'm going to quote a few of them. One of the things that I'll probably do is just highlight what I think are some of the more interesting and important statements. Sorry, I'm skipping to the part that I think is most important. And she writes on page 243, the researchers who were filing this lawsuit that Judge Lamberth made his initial decision on started with the assumption that others hold, namely that it is unethical to do research on persons, and embryos are persons. Now, Maienschein says this statement, the statement by these researchers, amounts to the claim that, quote, we believe from metaphysical reasons that have nothing to do with science or the research involved that embryos are persons, unquote. That is, they are seeking to impose their own personal ethical beliefs on others, and they are doing this by pretending that they have scientific reasons for doing so. We're going to need to come back to that quote in my response to this particular article, but I want to quote another piece where Maienschein says, this is not the place for an in-depth discussion of what counts as a person, or how we define personhood. But start with Shoemaker. You can read about him in the footnotes. But, she says, the important point here is that developmental biologists agree that the early stages, when there is just a bunch of stem cells in the inner cell mass of the blastocyst, are biologically completely different from later developmental stages. Okay, now, she says, later on in this paragraph, apparently the only reason to pretend that this early blastocyst stage falls under the same description as later developmental stages is to support the a priori belief that embryos are persons. That is, advocates of this view want to take moral ought beliefs and attempt to impose them on others. They are attempting to draw is conclusions about the nature of embryos from their personal opinions. This is not good science, nor is it good ethics. She says, for those who insist that fertilization and cell division make a person, then presumably a lineage of cells derived from a fertilized egg and developing in culture should be a person also. She then argues we should allow stem cell research, partly because of the good science, the basic science that it can do, partly because of the good clinical outcomes that are likely once we apply the basic science in the future. She says, at this time, and given what we know now, we should both allow and conduct human embryonic stem cell research. First, in the United States, we accept that behaviors including carrying out research should be allowed if it does not involve significant harm to others. Then she applies this to embryonic stem cell research. Second, human embryonic stem cell research should not only be allowed, but also actually conducted. Here we have to show that there are actual benefits as well as no significant harms. She thinks that burden can be met. Therefore, human research carried out with cells from human embryos as well as other cell lines should be allowed and should be carried out.